What is political philosophy, and why is it different from political science? And why is it more important to study and understand than political science? First, political science is derived from political philosophy, specifically the modern understanding of political philosophy that comes from Machiavelli, Hobbes, Grotius, Locke, and others. Political philosophy was the original and remains the highest intellectual discipline and form of the study of things political. Political philosophy is, simply put, the philosophical study of how humans associate and organize themselves in society, with a specific focus on human nature and how political ideas and questions like what is justice, what is liberty, and what is the good society are derived and contingent upon human nature. Political philosophy, therefore, deals more with questions about the human condition and how humans organize themselves in political association. Political science, by contrast, deals with the study of power within political association. Political science is basically the non-thinking person's version of political philosophy, which was the result of the science of human action formulated by the modern political philosophers. Political philosophy can roughly be understood in two epochs, two ages, the classical and the modern. While reductive, this is the basic outline all students of political philosophy receive in their education. It is the dichotomy I received in my own education in philosophy and political philosophy. You study Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, Marcus Aurelius, Augustine, and so forth in the classical era. You study Machiavelli, Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, Mill, Marx, Lenin, Carl Schmitt, and so forth in the modern era. Throw in some of the classical political economists involved in political economy, like Adam Smith and David Ricardo too, and you start to get a comprehensive overview of the questions of human life, existence, and politics. Although we can divide political philosophy into these two eras, there are further distinctions within them. For example, Augustine is considered a classical figure, but he fundamentally rejects the classical conception of political philosophy, and we'll get to that in a bit at the end of this lecture. Machiavelli, Hobbes, Lenin, and Schmitt are considered part of the modern tradition of political philosophy, just like Locke, Rousseau, Mill, and Marx are, but all of these figures can be understood as offering different conceptions of power within the modern political philosophical tradition, and we'll get to this too in a little bit. So to begin, the classical tradition of political philosophy, found among famous names like Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, and Marcus Aurelius, names that you are probably all at least familiar with, assert that the nature and destiny of man is political. As Aristotle famously said, man is a political animal. From this understanding of human nature, man as a social creature who forms and lives in community, the polis, comes the understanding that the highest calling of human life, and therefore the destiny of humanity, is in politics. The meaning of human existence is to be found in politics. And in this political life, according to the ancient tradition, the classical tradition, we live lives of virtue because it is from virtue that freedom and happiness ultimately derive. Thus, it is sometimes said that the classical tradition of political philosophy is virtue politics. The modern tradition of political philosophy shares this basic understanding with the classical tradition, that the nature and destiny of man is also political. Yet despite this agreement, at least regarding the nature and destiny of humanity, there is a major separation between the two. As Leo Strauss highlighted in his famous work, natural right and history, even though political life is the highest calling and destiny of mankind in both classical and modern political philosophy, their understanding of what this means is radically different. The classical tradition maintains, as mentioned, that virtue is necessary for the good life in politics, that virtue is the guardian of liberty against tyranny and injustice, and therefore only a virtuous society will ultimately be free and just. One only need read a little bit of Cicero, who lived through the tumultuous years and the final decades of the Roman Republic as it slipped into demagoguery and tyranny, to see this. The same with reading Marcus Aurelius, even though he himself was an emperor. Some modern political era thinkers who revived the classical humanistic tradition, like John Milton, James Harrington, John Trenchard, and Thomas Gordon of the famous Cato letters, also share this understanding. "Love virtue, for she alone is free," Milton said. The classical and humanistic tradition of politics, therefore, understands virtue and freedom as interlinked, understands that justice and virtue are interlinked, and that by living a virtuous life, from which freedom, justice, and goodness derives, the highest fulfillment of human existence can manifest itself. This idea of virtuous politics is rejected by the modern idea of political philosophy, starting with Machiavelli, and continuing through the modernist tradition of politics, from which political science is ultimately born. For anybody who has studied political science as opposed to political philosophy knows, you don't spend any time on ideas and philosophy like virtue ethics. Machiavelli believes that political life is the highest calling and the ultimate destiny of mankind, and to this extent, he and all of his heirs agree with the classical tradition. Man's nature is political. However, unlike the classical tradition, as we've said, he is unconcerned with virtue. Instead, Machiavelli and the modernist conception of politics and political philosophy is concerned with power. Machiavelli arrived at this belief from his reading of Augustine and Livy, The City of God, and Livy's History of Rome. In fact, when you read the classical authors and their humanistic heirs of the 17th and 18th century, the American founding fathers being the most famous, of course, what you find is a constant concern for the unity of virtue and liberty in the classical authors and their 17th and 18th century heirs. But this concern for virtue is entirely absent in the modern political philosophers. Hence why some scholars refer to this modern group of political thinkers who also believe in the unity of virtue and freedom as political humanists. Instead of virtue, Machiavelli and the modern political philosophers are interested, as we've said, in power. That power is the nature of humanity and itself the clashing dialectic of the entire world. To modern thinkers like Machiavelli, Hobbes, yes, even Locke, whom you've been lied to about from the propaganda machine of libertarianism, they're just interested in power as well. To them, power and liberty are, in fact, the same thing. When they speak or write of liberty, as Hobbes does, note what he says liberty is, quote, absence of external impediments. Absolute power over the body is the modern understanding of liberty, because that is the only understanding of human nature, the power of the body. It is not, per the ancients, the ability to choose truth and goodness. It is simply to do as the body pleases, without external impediments. From the modern understanding of political philosophy as being all about power, we can further break down the modern conception of political philosophy into two groups. one sees power ultimately residing in the ruler, the political organization, the party, or the state, or to carry it forward after the Great Depression and World War II, for those who are familiar with James Burnham, power also resides in political bureaucracy. We can call this version of modern political philosophy the statist or collectivist understanding, or the autocratic understanding of politics. Power ultimately resides in the single ruler, Machiavelli, the state, Hobbes or Schmitt, the party or the party vanguard, Lenin, or the administrative bureaucracy, per James Burnham's analysis. In this tradition of modern political philosophy, there is a greater force above the self that has authority or control over the body. You also have a second group within this modern understanding of political philosophy that sees power as residing in the self. And the goal of politics is to empower the self as much as possible. This sometimes is remembered erroneously as the so-called classical liberal idea. But it's not actually about freedom like you've been lied to. It's really just about power. The empowerment of the self to have bodily mastery over the self, over nature. This is also derived from the philosophy of Francis Bacon. The power of the bodily individual is absolute. The power of the bodily individual to do as he or she pleases is absolute. The power of the bodily individual to rule over his or her domain is, therefore, the purpose of human life and existence. Famous names like Locke, Rousseau, and Mill, alongside political economists like Adam Smith and David Ricardo, promote this view where the individual is just a body that has power autonomy, where freedom simply means bodily power to do whatever the body desires, absent of those external impediments. The astute reader will have noticed that modern political philosophy is entirely materialistic in its understanding. Man is a body of mass in motion, as Hobbes defined us. Man is a pleasure-seeking economic animal, per Locke. All human action is a conflict of material bodies, per Marx. Power is based and resides in whoever controls the body, however the body is to be understood. You therefore have the statist or collectivist understanding of power. Power resides in some corporate or collective body that controls others, and the individual understanding of power. Power resides in the self, and all political instruments are meant to enhance the power of the self. The government needs to help me have more money to do what I want. The government needs to help me achieve justice from some sort of conflict that has caused me bodily harm. The government needs to guarantee me a home for my body to rest, and so on and so forth. You can see from this perspective, the so-called individual understanding of power, that all instruments of collective society simply serve me, the self. Some prefer to call this tradition the egoist school of politics, named after the egoist philosophy of Max Stirner, because politics and power is all about the I, the me, the ego. It's the empowerment of the ego to do whatever the ego wants, with any and all external impediments brushed aside. The idea that political life is the highest calling and destiny of mankind, however, is not the only view of human life. As mentioned earlier, a fellow by the name of St. Augustine, though part of the so-called classical tradition just as a result of the epoch he lived in, rejected this idea of human existence. Eric Voegelin, for instance, noted that it is the gift of the Augustinian inheritance that provided for the true individuality and personality of society to emerge, since the triune Godhead we participate in is itself personal. We live not in an impersonal cosmos, but a cosmos that cares, with souls that also care, and we join together in care and love of each other, which provides for the cultivation of virtue and the meaningful lives of love we live in the world. Augustine, therefore, rejected the idea that politics is where meaning, happiness, and virtue in life was to be found. Instead, to love and be loved, as he said, is the highest calling and destiny of humanity. To give yourself in love to another and to have that love reciprocated by the beloved is where true virtue and happiness is found. Politics and political order, to the extent that it is necessary and needed, Augustine explained in The City of God, serves to maintain civil peace and order, which allows the multitude of human loves to manifest themselves in life, nothing more and nothing less. But how did Machiavelli, who was a student of Augustine's writings, conclude that politics is about power instead of virtue and freedom, like the ancient writers believed? Augustine deconstructed the mythology of Roman politics in The City of God, using the Romans' own historians and writers to do so. In the first half of The City of God, Augustine laments that behind the Roman claims of virtue was an emptiness of life, an empire of lies. The Roman ideals of honor, virtue, nobility, and patriotism simply mask the brutal reality of their lust to dominate. Look no further than some of Rome's greatest heroes, who died horrible deaths or were exiled by the Romans. Scipio, the man who saved the Republic and defeated Hannibal, the virtuous patriot if there ever was one, was indicted and retired, exiled by the Roman state, which forced him out of politics, out of the Senate, out of the city of Rome. He died broke and alone, despite his life of service and sacrifice. Today, we don't even know where Scipio was buried. Cicero, too, Augustine laments, another virtuous patriot and lover of liberty if there ever was one in Rome, was condemned as an enemy of the state and murdered. The actual history of Roman politics wasn't one of virtue and liberty, but vice and corruption, the pursuit of power. All those who dedicated themselves to a life of politics ended up murdered, exiled, or dying lonely deaths without friends. Machiavelli thought Augustine's deconstructed reading of Roman politics and history to be fundamentally accurate. Augustine's only problem, according to Machiavelli, was he believed love was a true reality. God, because God is love, and love is God. Machiavelli was, in private, an atheist. In a word, he was somebody who rejected the possibility of love, because a world without God is a world without love. All there is, therefore, is chaos and power, the kind of chaos and power Augustine saw as truly governing Roman politics and the city of man. Augustine, importantly, created the contrast we know well from our artistic and cultural tradition. Think of all the great movies, the poetry, the novels, the dramas, the stories, Shakespeare and Wagner most especially, that play on this dichotomy, as do the poets of the Romantic tradition. This is why, to quote one scholar, Augustine was the arch-romantic before the Romantics. To live a life in politics is to ultimately see your own downfall, to end up corrupted, to fall into the despairing pit of darkness and tyranny, death and destruction. Richard III by Shakespeare is a perfect illustration of this. To free yourself from this hellhole, to embrace love and sacrifice for others, is the path of redemption and sanctification. Consider Prospero at the end of The Tempest. The love of another is the healing heart to this broken world. To break free from the political and live a life of love, provides the highest meaning to human existence. It is in love, not politics, that true virtue and happiness is found. It is the love of knowing another and caring for them which brings the meaning, happiness, and virtuous life which we all seek. From the study of political philosophy, you can now collapse the classical and modern dichotomy, because we ultimately have two different understandings of human nature, out of which our understandings of political order derive. There is, from the classical and the modern traditions, the understanding that politics is the alpha and omega, the beginning and the end of all things. As Eric Voegelin explained in his writings, this view always inevitably reduces itself to cosmic totalitarianism of some sort. Yes, even in the libertarian framework, because you have the absolute tyranny of the individual. As Rousseau famously said, if you choose to not live a political life, you will be forced to be free. And isn't this what we see today? Those of us who reject a certain form of political activism today, who do not kowtow to the political sentiments, we are being forced to be free. Politics as the alpha and omega of existence comes from the godless, which is to say loveless, understanding of human nature. Man is simply a political animal, a body of mass in motion that needs to consume, and consume, a mere reflection of the material movement of the universe, constantly cascading and colliding with itself. Those who agree that politics is the highest calling and destiny of mankind nevertheless find themselves in the camps of either virtue politics, the classical and humanist tradition, state power politics, collectivist and statist, or self-power, for a lack of a better word, since most of us are familiar with it, the libertarian conception of politics. Those who reject the idea that politics is the highest calling and destiny of man, and instead see love as the meaning and purpose of existence, fall into the Augustinian imperative, a term coined by the political theorist William E. Connolly. Connolly argued that in the modern tradition, a neo-Augustinian school has emerged, mostly from among the postmodernists, Foucault being the most famous. Foucault agreed with Augustine that love, the care of the self, as Foucault termed it in his writing, thereby combining an element of Augustinianism with the bodily autonomism of a certain strand of modernist political philosophy, was the real purpose of life. Foucault, however, also agreed with an inverted understanding of modern political philosophy, that everything is still about power. You can see this conundrum, this contradiction or paradox that Foucault is now in. For Foucault and his followers, the purpose of politics is to seize the instruments and the organs of political power and transform them from oppression to love, compassion, and mercy. Connolly argued that modern politics is now a battle between those who agree with Foucault and believe power can be redeemed by some sense of compassion and mercy, and the traditional Machiavellians, who have no pretension to the mixing of love and power politics. For Connolly, the left-right dichotomy that we get in political science is a bunch of bullshit. It doesn't matter, and it just obscures the fact that politics is this contest between those who think power can be wielded to advocate policies of mercy and compassion, or those who don't even think and don't even have the pretension of mixing love and compassion with power and politics. To conclude with Leo Strauss and Eric Voegelin, the two most important political philosophers of the 20th century, the study of political philosophy ultimately ends up with the famous politico-theological question, which also occupied other thinkers like Nietzsche, Heidegger, Carl Schmitt, and more recently Jürgen Habermas and Giorgio Agamben. Since political philosophy is the study of human nature, the human condition, and human existence, and how from this human reality we ultimately end up with association and organization and politics, we find ourselves in this dynamic tension between the material pragmatism of philosophy, the city of man, and the creative spirit of theology, the city of God, and how the two are constantly at odds with each other. Strauss noted in his famous rereading of Plato, who himself was a rare cross of pragmatic philosopher and creative artist, that this contest is ultimately between the so-called philosophers and the so-called artists, with the artists, even if they do not know it, being on the side of the spirit, of theology. The most dangerous demagogues and tyrants, however, are the visionary leaders, since they steal the creative artistry of the divine and translate it into matter, destroying the spirit in the process. These are the Gnostic revolutionaries, per Voegelin. For Strauss, the real genius of Western political philosophy was in its inability to resolve this tension, thus allowing for both the path of material pragmatism and power and the path of the spirit to exist side by side, even if they have often clashed throughout history. This was the gift of Christianity in Western society, according to Strauss, which nurtured the seed of cultural artistry of love to serve as the antidote to the power pragmatism of mere politics. The question now, however, is can they both remain? Or do both remain? Do we even have a life of the spirit anymore? For whenever the spirit dies, totalitarianism follows, because the body, stripped of spirit, is, as Hegel said, but a lifeless corpse. And this is the ultimate question in political philosophy.